start recording it there. Go there and start there. Okay. Right. Creativity. Such an easy topic to talk about because it's so easy, obviously. Yeah, no, that's it is. It's a difficult thing to define. So just the schedule outline. I've shared this with you guys, so hopefully you guys understand. The timings I've put in just sort of general, but what we'll maybe find is the first stage we kind of fly through, and that will leave us a little bit more time to do the worked example at the end, I would hope. And I don't think the second phase as well, the illustrator phase, will take as much as 60 minutes to go through and explain where everything is. The other drawback we've got is obviously we've got this computer which you guys can get your hands on, and I'm quite happy for you guys to use this to try out some things and familiarise yourself with me kind of standing over your shoulder. We've also got the other one which has it on, but that's two computers between 5 of you guys, so there will be a little bit of lack of hands-on in that regard. We'll do our best to make sure that everyone has a chance to explore the interface and try some of the things that I will show you. The end goal for this is going through the process with support from me to recreate a logo that I created for one of my clients, Argyle Finance. It's one of my favourite clients simply because it's quite simple, but it is laden with design principles which I think are quite reflective of how I see design. I'll go through what I see as design in the first instance, but hopefully what you'll see from at that end point reflects what I think about creativity and what makes good designers and what makes good design at the end of it. If we've got time, we'll also then take that logo and show how that can be applied to something else. So like, for example, taking like what we did with the cybersecurity, we took a look and a feel of cybersecurity and then we applied it to the square format that you required for the booking system, the banner format that you needed for the booking system, and showing how a style that's derived, a style we can apply that is derived from the identity that we create for a logo, for example. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions before we start? None? Okay. Right, I will go through this as best I can. Okay, phase one, my experience and perspectives. The first thing, I've recruited designers on a few occasions, and there are kind of 3 general things that I look for in designers. I actually generally find it very difficult in young designers because a lot of what they're trying to do basically goes flat up against what I'm looking for, like it's just the opposite of what I'm looking for, and it's generally down to being too keen about it. So it's a good thing to be able to be aware of these things at the start. If you guys are, I know you guys are not aspiring to become freelance graphic designers by any means, but even just applying some of the elements of it, when you get tools to be able to do design, it doesn't mean you have to use them all. So my first thing I look for is an ability to KISS. Does anyone know what KISS stands for? Have you ever come across this? Tim? Keep it simple, stupid. Sorry. We'll have HR on. You'll never guess what the thing says. Keeping it simple. Good design is not about doing too much. If you take the example that I've got in here, you've got 2 adverts side by sides, one for BMW, one for a car sales. Now, I do appreciate that the website for the car sales is very much older than the other one, but you can see how, because there's so much in it, it becomes very difficult to comprehend what you're trying to communicate. And it allows me to kind of put across this maxim that I've always said: if everything is a priority, nothing is. And so it's not always about throwing as much design on a page as possible. Sometimes a very simple solution is far more elegant and far more easier to portray than a complicated one. The second one, does anyone know the reference I'm making here? Any Star Trek fans?
John?
Yes. She's the empath.
She's the empath. Empathy is the next thing, which I think is very, very important. Being able to understand what your users are looking for is a very, very important aspect. To take the example of what we did with the cybersecurity, when we did the Cyber Room's trailer. The point there was to try and inspire an emotion, to try and enforce an emotion onto people, and that was a little bit of excitement, a little bit of urgency, a little bit of mystery. So it's trying to understand what the user, what you want the user to feel, and what the user wants to feel at the end of it is a very, very important characteristic that I look for in designers. It's not always about doing the most exciting thing as well. If you take the example of EasyJet and British Airways, for example, when EasyJet was launched as a low price point offering, had they went in with a style that mimicked British Airways as a luxury brand, there would have been a disconnect between what the user was expecting and what they were communicating. And so having that empathy to understand what your end user wants or expects is a very important factor. And the other, this is just to say, if you can get that, then that's very, very important. This is a great example I've always used. The top one is a Warburton's advert that I think completely got it wrong. And the bottom one, does anyone know what that advert is?
It's Hovis, isn't it?
It's Hovis.
Yeah.
I've not said Hovis on that anywhere, but you've recognised it. And that's because it really plays on a strong emotion, and that's nostalgia. I mean, I can almost smell bread when I look at that advert because of the investment that they've made in that. And people who are able to empathise well are able to, be better designers because they're trying to, they understand what the person is looking for. So empathy is another thing. The final thing. No, I don't need anyone to clean my dustbins out for me. It's just cleanliness. It's just a very clean artboard, a very clean design generally is a very good thing for me. It just makes the artwork that you produce so much more legible when you're not trying to flood people with information. Here's just an example of it. This doesn't come out well at all in the slides, but this is some sketches that a client sent to me. Who fancied himself as a wee bit of a designer. He kind of knew what layout that he wanted, and he just sent that over and said, Alistair, can you reproduce that please? And I nearly had a heart attack. Anxiety pangs in my chest and everything. Because just everything's all over the place. If you just look at it, there's not any consistency. There's font sizes at different sizes. It's basically what he was trying to say was there's 3 different companies and I want to have this information for that one, this information for that one, and there was no coherence whatsoever. And so in the discussions with him, which were long and they were somewhat torturous, we kind of concluded at that design. And you can see how much kind of cleaner and simpler it is. There was a kind of consistent data set so that people, when they were looking at one page versus the other, they were able to, basically understand what they were being asked to do. And that was absorb some information, get the main selling points, and have a consistent sort of contact call to action in it. And it's just so much cleaner and so much easier to understand as a result. These are just universal principles of good design. I kind of feel like you don't always achieve this, but if your design can be described as any of or as many of these 5 elements, I think you're doing well. Good design is aesthetic. That's almost self-explanatory. Good design should look good. Good design is legible. You should be able to understand what it is that the person is trying to communicate with their creativity. Long-lasting. You don't want something that's necessarily faddy, that just prescribes to a fad. It's intelligent, and by intelligent I don't necessarily mean it has to look like a scholar by any means. It should have some insight to it, I think, is my point here. Doing design for design's sake never really appealed to me. There should be something rooted in the design. I'm kind of cutting forward here to a later to what we're going to be producing. I'll actually just come out. I see no problem with kind of cutting forwards and backwards. The design that I'm going to get you guys working on later is for Argyle Financial, and it's a good example of how I think it's kind of there's intelligent design to this. Whilst it's very simple and it's very clear, there's a lot in it. The proprietor of this business is called Ian Cairns. So their previous logo was a cairn. If you know what a cairn is, like the stones that you find at the top of things. And so the A of the triangles is designed to be shaped like a cairn. It's Argyll, so the triangles are kind of like the Argyll pattern. He is very much into outdoors and water-based sports, and so the greens and the blues influenced that element. And of course, it makes the shape of a rudimentary A as well. So there's lots of kind of insights within just a very, very simple design, and that's what I mean by intelligent. It should have these kind of aspects to it when you're doing it. If it's done exceptionally well, I think that's me giving myself a pat on the back, of course, for doing good design. Well done, Alistair. Where did we get to? And useful. It should have a purpose. Again, design for design's sake is, I know it doesn't always seem like the most effective use of time. I always try with clients to try and produce things which have a direct business end to it, if at all possible. Okay, so still in the introduction, but we're beginning to look more at the programs. So these are all of the, or not all of the programs, but a lot of the programs that Adobe have on offer. After Effects, Premiere Pro, Photoshop, Lightroom, InDesign, Adobe Illustrator, XD. I don't actually know what that one is. I've put it up here, and I can't. I think that's a user experience interface program. Dreamweaver, Audition, and Animate. But generally, the four that I use are After Effects, Photoshop, InDesign, and Illustrator. That's my meat and drink, as it were. So we're going into the phase now where we just look at each one and what their purpose is. So beginning with After Effects. After Effects is a digital visual effects, motion graphics, and compositing application. Basically, it creates animations for various purposes. I've used it for in adverts. I use it for web production. I use it for infographics. I've used it for producing GIFs. I've used it for producing information stands at conferences.
Used for the 10 steps animation.
And that's what I use for the 10 steps animation. Absolutely. So it creates it in. I would say a far easier way than you would imagine. I think I was saying this to Evelyn at the start. Designing is one thing. Making those designs animate feels like a hyper jump forward, but it really isn't. It's just about configuration thereafter. If you've done your job in terms of the design, and it remains clean and tidy and well laid out, and it's not remarkably busy, a lot of the things, and we'll show this in the training session if you're available for that on Friday, how easy it is to take a static image and animate it for different purposes.
Had it also been used for the likes of, I'm thinking of the other webinar assets, the lower thirds? Would that have been?
Yeah, absolutely. So it can be used for the lower third. So I've used it in, well, I say broadcast, but yeah, in this case, live streaming. Yes, it can be used for lower thirds, for the credits, anything that's animated there that's not, the stinger was produced in that. It's a very, very minor difference. I think one of the stages of the training session on Friday is about exporting for different purposes, and because generally what you'll be using it for is web purposes rather than broadcast, the only real difference in the exporting is going to be whether or not you're exporting it with a transparent background or not a transparent background. Stingers and lower thirds will have transparent backgrounds. Credits, for example, wouldn't necessarily have transparent backgrounds. So, as simple as that. Okay, so that's After Effects. The next one is Photoshop. Photoshop's become a verb. To Photoshop something, everyone kind of knows what Photoshop is from the fact that you can edit photographs, and that's basically what it is. It's a raster and bitmap graphics editor. Do you guys understand the difference between a bitmap and a vector graphic?
John probably does.
Yes, John does. Does anyone other than John know the answer to this one? Yeah.
I used to, but I need it fresh, Alistair.
Okay, so basically, bitmap graphics are pixels that make images. Vectors use mathematical equations to produce pictures. Bitmaps are good for photographs because you can very efficiently create very nuanced images and highly detailed images, but they're not very good at scaling up. So if you have a bitmap image that is, say, 500 pixels wide, you wouldn't be able to use that on a poster, on a large format poster, because when you scale it up, you would see the pixels. As opposed to with a vector graphic, when you scale it up, because it's done through mathematical equations, it scales up very smoothly and it adapts to that size. It also means that when you are doing things with, for example, After Effects, when you're animating it, the mathematical equations look a lot smoother as a result when you're kind of scaling things and zooming in on things. And so yes, it's a difference between pixels and mathematical equations to create the work. Illustrator is an example of a vector program for creating vector design assets. Photoshop, whilst they do have vector elements to it, generally speaking, it's a bitmap raster editor. The next is InDesign. InDesign is basically desktop publishing. If you understand the difference between, if you need to understand the difference of when you would use InDesign as opposed to Illustrator, because both can do vector graphics. In fact, that's probably a poor description of it. InDesign is basically a framework into which you can import vector graphics and bitmap graphics, and it's the frame that holds it together. You can then add the text layers to it, and it creates this kind of multi-page document possibility. I would use InDesign when I'm doing multi-page documents. So if I'm doing reports or brochures, anything over a couple of pages, I would tend to use InDesign, because the reason to use InDesign is that it has more powerful styling. So if I want to define a style at the start of the project, so the text would be 10 points in height at a dark grey. If I then want to change that to 12 point, I can change that universally within InDesign. It's a lot more difficult to do that within Illustrator. So it's basically a desktop publishing format. And finally, Illustrator. Industry standard vector graphics application to create logos, icons, drawings, typography, illustrations for print, web, video and mobile. And I use it for all of those things and probably a few other things as well. This is the program that I use most often. It's also, as a result, the one that when I'm trying to describe it, I will make the most amount of mistakes, because I am using shortcuts and time-saving efficiencies that you might not necessarily see or hear me audibly describe. Where you see that or where I do something that doesn't look like I've explained, remember, please stop me and I'll try and take a note and put any shortcuts. It's just little things like when I'm selecting the type tool, I'll press T rather than go into a menu to select it. So this is what I use mostly. I use it for a whole manner of stuff. I think there's some examples of what I've used it with to create it with later on in the program. In fact, I think this is it. So some examples of the things that I've used, that I've created with it recently. You'll recognise the cyber escape rooms element. So that's an example of web banners that I've created with it. Infographics, the incremental sort of infographic sheet there. Logos, Global Ethical Finance Initiative. That's the most recent design that I've done for a logo. Any of you gin drinkers? Yeah. A bit. There's a Kintyre gin. The boar there is the mascot of the Kintyre gin.
That's good.
And Scintilla is an intellectual property specialist law firm. So that's a pull-up banner. There's illustration, logos, infographics, web graphics. I use it for all these things, and I use it also in the preparation of After Effects graphics as well. So some examples.
What's the connection between boar and gin?
It's there are lots of boars, or there were historically lots of boars in the Kintyre region, and it's the Kintyre gin. So I suppose, or is it to do with the mascot? It might be to do with the mascot of their house. Yeah, it could be they own a property out there, Torresdale Estate, and it looks pretty grand. And I wonder whether there's
Was there a brief to you to include the boring summary?
yes, that's right.
Bore it.
Yeah. Okay, so we move on to the interface. So this is what you get when you load up the Illustrator program. I'll go through this in the presentation first, and then I'll come into the program and I'll show you how bits and bobs work within it, different tools and configuration panels. But just so we're familiar with the environment, the first thing is the control panel. So this is when all the way along the top. It's context driven. So this control panel changes as you use different tools. So if you use a type tool, it will give you options to do with type and paragraph and editing, font selection. If you're using scaling tools, it will change to a scaling method. So it's very context driven. It's intelligent enough to know that when you're using certain tools, you need to be able to amend different things. So that's a control panel. What I like about it is that it's metrics focused, and this comes back to what I was saying about having very clean and tidy work. If, for example, I'm using a scaling tool, I can change the size of an object on the artboard by dragging the shape of it and making it a particular size to the eye. But what I would like to be able to do is make sure it's the perfect size in the first instance, rather than actually just dragging it to a particular size. The control panel having elements like, I think you can see just at the sort of top towards the right hand side there, your X, your Y, your W and your H. So X and Y is its position on an artboard, and W and H, obviously width and height. You can define within the control panel exactly what width and height you want once the object's been selected, and that just gives you a far more control of precision over it, rather than just dragging things. Because you can drag that and it can be, say if you're aiming for 100 millimeters, you can drag it to 99.924 millimeters. That 9.24 really annoys me. I want it to be exactly 100 millimeters, so you can use that to actually precisely define it, and that allows you to have a lot cleaner artwork as a result. So that just makes it very good for organising. It also does things like it gives you contexts when you've selected different items, how you want to align things. So if you want objects to be in line horizontally, vertically, to be distributed evenly between gaps, it gives you these options within the control panel as well. As I say, I'll just fly through the control panels, and then we'll go in and we'll kind of see some of that in action. Next element is the toolbar. So this is for the creation and manipulation of objects. As I was saying before, largely it's obsolete to power users because they won't literally go onto the toolbar, click on something, and then go and operate it. They'll use shortcuts to be able to do it. I can, and I'll take a note of this, I can supply you with a list of those shortcuts, because as you go to use it, as you become more familiar with it, you'll find that it's a lot easier to press T rather than to go and select the type tool, to press A instead of select the selection tool. These shortcuts just speed things up immeasurably. And be aware of hidden tools. You might note besides some of the objects, but some of the tools, but not all of the tools, there's a little triangle to the bottom right hand corner of it. I don't know if it's possible to zoom in any further. I don't think it is. I'll point out on the screen. These wee dots here are little triangles. Where you see those, there are some hidden tools behind it. So, for example, where you see on the left hand of the tools panel, you can see a square. If you click and hold on that icon, it will also show you star objects, circle objects, ellipse objects, and polygon objects. So you can define different there's hidden tools behind those. Going over to the other side, you have the sidebar, very creatively named because it appears at the side. This is far more for the configuration of objects. If you take the left-hand sidebar, the toolbar, as being the where you create the objects. This is where you configure it. So you can affect going down the list. You can use the sidebar options to change the color, color guides, which allows you to kind of pick within different types of palettes. Swatches is, I mean, if you've done any interior design, swatches are a simple selection of kind of things. Swatches is defined colours, and you can add to a swatch so that you're using the same swatch throughout the design process. You'll see, I'll show you that in use when we go to produce the logo later on. But it's very good because then you're not just picking any old green. You know you're picking a particular green, and you can have confidence that that green is going to be replicated elsewhere in your artwork when you select swatches.
And will it give you any guidance on that, on tonal matches or anything for a swatch? So if you say, oh, I definitely want this colour on, will it help you in terms of the colour wheel sort of get your exact complementary colour on?
So that's what the colour guide would do. When you open up colour guide, it has different approaches to colours in that respect. I do find the colour guide to be quite limiting, so I use online tools to actually come up with more innovative, sort of more interesting colour swatches. But yeah, so colour guides is probably closer to what you're describing there.
Okay.
Absolutely. I'll not go through all of these. Some particularly to note, gradients, stroke, transparency are good when you're kind of configuring objects on the artboard. Appearance is a very strong one, about halfway down there, because it holds all of the definitions for a particular object in one panel. So if you select an object, when the appearance panel is available to you, you can almost define any single part of it, whether it's to do with the when I say, I'm using terms here that you probably don't even, you may not be familiar with, like stroke. When I talk about stroke, that talks about the outline of an object. So when you have appearance open, you can affect the stroke, the width of it, the transparency of it, the colour of the object, all of these things. Going down the list again, layers is quite important in terms of organising your artwork. That allows you to have multiple different tiers, each appearing on top of the other, like layers, obviously. So that just allows you to organise your work a little bit. Artboards is the next one. We'll show shortly what an artboard is, but you can have multiple artboards within a single file, which is quite a useful commodity interesting feature to have. We'll explain that a little bit in the next animation, next slide. Transform, Align, and Pathfinder. These are all very useful tools. I think it's probably best to demonstrate how those are used rather than trying to define them just now. So just moving on, this is an artboard. The white segment in the middle, you can pick what size of artboard when you open a file for the first time, but you can also add multiple artboards to a single file, which is quite useful because, for example, if you're producing a series of web graphics for an event, for example, you can choose different sizes of artboards depending on the size of the graphic that's required. You might need a banner, you might need a square image for social media, you might need a square image which is simply an avatar that doesn't have much detail on it. And you can do all of these single requirements within one file rather than having 3 different files open, meaning that you've got access to the same swatch selection, for example. The same fonts are open and available within it, and changes that you make to the swatches, for example, are then replicated through the different artboards. It's quite a powerful tool to be able to use. So that's an artboard, and when I talk about a workspace, basically I'm talking about the whole interface. You can define different workspaces depending on what your purposes are. Generally, I don't think that's really an area that we're going to get to in this training, but for example, if you are an illustrator, a vector illustrator, you'll have a preference to using certain tools within the program, and changing your workspace can allow those elements to be on the board and remove everything that's unnecessary. So it's just about how you configure your workspace. So when I talk about workspace, I'm talking about the whole thing. The default workspace is probably the best one for you guys. It's because it's got all the tools available to it to you. My workspace looks, not on this computer because I've reverted to the default for this purpose, but at home it's a very, very different one because I don't like the distraction of having all the tools available to me when I'm only going to use a few of them in my day-to-day job. Okay, so that's quickly whizzed through some of the interfaces. Just to go into a little bit more detail, the tools. So what I'll do is just highlight again here. These are the tools that I kind of tend to use most often. If we start at the top two are selection tools. The top left hand is the kind of general selection tool. Though I don't tend to use that one that often. More powerful is the direct selection tool, which is the white arrow with the plus. The reason that is far more powerful is when you get to a position where you have a lot of things on the artboard, you can begin to group them. And when you have a general selection tool, it always picks up the biggest possible chunk of items. So I'll swap over into Illustrator, and I'll just explain that through a demonstration. So, say for example, I'm just going to put on a variety of different shapes. A couple of squares. There's the hidden objects. I'm just pressing and holding. There's a polygon. So we've got 3 different shapes there. Say I want that to create one object. I can select all of the tools by using this direct selection tool. Drag and select them, and then I can go to Object and Group, and now they become a group. We can see when we select the general selection tool, when I click on any one of those, it takes the group. When I take the direct selection tool, I'm just going to click off of that now, I can just select one element of it, and that's powerful if you want to manipulate just a single part of the artwork, but you still want things to be grouped for the purposes of keeping things as arranged as you want. What I really like about the direct selection tool is once you've got one selected, if you then want to take the whole group, you don't have to take the direct the group selection. You can just click on it again and it begins to pick up the rest of it. And you can do that as multiples as well. So if I throw down a circle and then I group them all, a shortcut for group is Command and G, so that's them all now grouped. If I go into the selection tool and then select them all, they're all selected now. Whereas if I use the direct selection tool and I choose one of the 3 originals, I click on the first one for a single click, a second click picks up the original group, a third click picks up the rest, and it progressively works through till it picks up everything within that group. So the direct selection tool, in fact, it's so useful that it's the default system, the default setup when you get Illustrator doesn't have a shortcut for the direct selection tool. It's the first thing I always do when I use anyone's computer is I always change the keyboard's shortcut so that I've got that instantly available, and it's smack bang in the middle of my. I use the J key for it because the shortcut for a J key when you set up, when you get the default setup is for charts, and I never use like a chart creating tool whatsoever when I'm producing graphics. So I just use J for that, and that's my shortcut for pulling that up. So that's the selection tools. Just to show another way that the groups are kind of you can access or you can recognize where the groups are. If you go into the layers section, which is this one. We've only got one layer on the artboard just now, and if you can see there's a wee arrow beside it. If you click down on that, it will show you a group. If you click down on the next arrow, it will show you the components of the groups, and you can see we've got the 3 elements, which are these 3 elements are as a group. Within the next up group there are 2 elements, that's the first group and this Lisp, and they form part of that wider group. So that's another way to see the contents of a group is through the layers. Okay, so just select that. The shortcuts for these keys, as I said, I always set up the group selection tool as J, but there's no, it's me that's defined it as J. I don't think it has a particular shortcut. If you want to set up a shortcut, I can show you that at a later point. The shortcut for the selection tool is V. So if I've got a different tool selected, like like for one of the polygons, if I click on V, it brings up that tool. Okay.
So the direct select isn't drawn by default on the
It
toolbar?
isn't by default. I'll show you how to set that up. If you want to change, if you want to create a shortcut for it, I think it's in Edit. Yes, Edit, Keyboard Shortcuts. And so you find the commands. You can either have shortcuts based on tools or by menu commands. So the menu commands are the ones that you define, that you find up here. In this case, it's a tool, and the tool is group selection. And you just go into the shortcut there and just, in this case, it's J. And select OK. That's how you define a tool. Okay. So going back into Keynote. Actually, at what point do you want to take breaks at any point in this? Is there?
I'm sure it'd be good on
We're scheduled to have about 4:30, so
whenever you think is sensible then.
Okay. Well, if at any point you guys feel that it's time for a break.
That's
no, I don't think it's on. Oh, is it on, is it?
Yep.
Oh.
There you go.
Just nail over here. Sorry, Alistair.
That's okay. Okay, the next layer includes the type tool. So rather than sort of do these in groups, I think the type tool is worth exploring just now. So I'll come out of Keynote again and go back into Illustrator. This is exactly as you would imagine. And when you click on the type tool, shortcut for that is a T. It's actually handily when you hover over one of the tools. You might be able to see in brackets. I don't know if the definition is brilliant on it. It tells you in brackets what the shortcut is for it. So in this case, it's T. So you get this cursor up, and there are several hidden options when it comes to the type tool. Let me just bring those up. So type area tool, type on path, vertical type. Some of them are quite self-explanatory. I think it's probably worth just focusing on type tool just now rather than any of the variations of it. Once you've got that, you can do two things immediately with it. First, if you just click on the artboard, it gives you up some dummy text. I'm just going to zoom in. If you want to zoom in, there's two options. This is me catching myself of trying to do things rather than just doing the shortcuts. You've got a zoom tool, which is conveniently a magnifying glass. That gives you a new cursor. And you can either click to zoom in, or you can click and hold and it will zoom in, or you can click and, well, you can't click and hold anymore, it's a new feature. Yes, you can either click in or click and hold, and it will zoom in on a particular space. So you see when I've added the type tool, I've had the type tool selected. A single click will bring up, it says lorem ipsum, but that's just dummy text. I just type in, and there's text. In its place. Are you familiar with lorem ipsum text? Is this a term you've come across? The amount of times I've had to explain to people reviewing my work why it's written in Latin is unbelievable. You'd think I would have it memorised for having used it, but there's different variations of it. I think, but may I explain? I think is lorem ipsum.
You used to have something you could do in the word courses, you press a button and it put what
That was random, wasn't it? Rand.
You can do
You
rand,
did rand in the brackets.
There's a lorem ipsum version of it.
Yeah.
I can't remember the
Anyway,
Yeah, so with a lot of web design, you do see that. That is the kind of placeholder text to give them an idea of what.
So they know what it looks like. Yeah.
Dreamweaver does the same, doesn't it? To train Dreamweaver.
It comes from
Yeah.
typesetting.
Yeah, that's right. And it's a natural distribution.
Could lay out
Yeah.
the text without actually having the actual text
Yeah, available.
dummy Latin instead.
So when you click, it gives you text already. It uses lorem ipsum just to as a placeholder. You can also, if you click and you drag, you can create a square, and it will fill that with dummy text as well. And when you see it inverted like that, so white on the black, that means you know it's been selected. So if I type in that, it will restrict itself to that box. So that's free text and text area as options. When you've got that text, again, you can select the direct selection tool to select it. With the text area, it operates slightly different. If you select the text in free text, you can do whatever you want with that. Whereas with the text area, it's slightly complicated because you can define either the box or the text. If you click on the text itself, it will select it all, and that's you changing the text configuration. The box, you can change the box. You'll see here, this is your color and stroke selection area. When it's got a red stripe through the white, that means it's transparent. So it's got a transparent stroke, which is the outline, and a transparent fill because the box has been selected, not the text. When I select the text, you'll see that it turns into the black with the transparent. So that's black text. So that's how you create the text. Now what you can do to edit the text is simply use, if you remember before I said about the control panel, you can see that it's now changed to being things which are relevant to text. So this is your font, Myriad Pro. You can choose any number of different fonts. Something jazzy. Let's go with that one just now. So that's you selecting the font. Where you have this drop down, that's selecting the weight. That font only has one weight, which is inconvenient to me demonstrating it. If we go back to Muso, for example, different fonts define the weight of the fonts differently. Some use numbers, some use words. In this case with Muso Sans, they use numbers. You can change it to be in the different weights of it and the italicized version of it, I should say. So 500 is a nice round kind of number for that one. Also the size of it with a drop down option. But you can also double click on that and fill it in to be whatever you want. 72 type font. You can also, instead of using the zoom tool, you can use command and plus and minus to zoom in and out. Just get rid of that. And you can also change the alignment of the text. So you'll notice below the text there's a small line but also a dot. The dot is where the anchor point is. So in this case, because it's left aligned text, the dot is to the left. If I change this to center aligned, the dot remains in the center, and right aligned, it appears on the right hand side. So that's your options for basic alignment there. You'll note, and that moves it according to the anchor point. You'll note when we have a text area, when I change the size of the type area, the text fills the space rather than increases in size. I'm going to just add some dummy text here by doing option fill with placeholder text. When you change the alignment within a text area, it restricts it to within the box rather than moving everything wholly left and right as you did with free text.
So there's a way in which if you want that box to appear exactly in the middle of your canvas.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just going to zoom out to show you that. Let's go back. So this is it's the artboard rather than the canvas. No, that's okay. It's okay. The way the alignment works. We do come to it later on, but I think it's good to jump into it whilst your questions are fresh. It works within again context. So if you select a single item, let's see if it gives you some options there. You'll see within the control panel, it's changed to the type one. It still thinks that you might need a line, so it's giving you a line, but it's giving you it as a low priority, which means it's further off to the right. If I was to make the window smaller, for example, it would drop off because it's less important than some of these other things, or some other things would drop off or would get assumed into other drop downs. If you click on the align button there, you get all of these options. So, and you also have, and this is what I mean by context, you can align it to a selection. So if you've selected multiple items, you would align it to within that selection or to the artboard. So we'll keep it on the artboard just now. and with the whole area selected, align center and also center of the artboard. So that box now appears in the bottom. If I select multiple items, so I can do that either by using direct selection or the selection tool, dragging and collecting them, I can then go to align and I can change that to selection, and if I click on center align there, it will align them centrally. What I think is quite useful, I use this quite a lot, is say for example I want to keep this headline text where it is, but I want this to conform to the alignment with that. If I select both of them and then I use the selection tool, if I click on the key object, if I click on the object that I want to remain in place, you'll see it turns it a wee bit blue. That defines it as the key object on the in this selection. And when I go to align now, if I left align it, it will define it based on the key object, which is very, very useful, very powerful thing to be able to do, because there are always going to be things within an artboard which are exactly where you want it to be or have greater priority, and you want to align them to those.
Right. Okay.
Good question. Okay, so that's the type. You can also change the color of these. There's a number of ways that you can change the color. With the object selected, you can just double click, and then you've got a full gamut of colors available to you. You can change these either by dragging the color wheel and then selecting a color. You can also change the hexadecimal figure. Hexadecimal is a color system used on the internet, and that's a combination of letters and numbers between 0 and 9 and A and F to define what a color is.
What's our colour codes, John? Do you remember them? You used to know them off by heart.
Oh, I thought that, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
University brand ones.
Oh,
Right.
blue from the
I did a job for the Glasgow Underground when I was working at a design agency, and the whole design theme was orange, everywhere, orange. So I'm quite keen of an FF3300. It's imprinted on my head. And if you want the Pantone colour reference for that is 023. So yes. So you can also choose it by RGB and CMYK values. CMYK is a printed press colour system. Cyan, magenta, yellow and black. Don't know why they didn't go for CMYB, but CMYK. I've never had a good answer for that.
Could be blue as well.
Yeah, well, that's a good answer. That's as good an answer as I've ever been offered. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, blue's not cyan, but yeah, no, that would make some amount of sense. I've asked printers that, and they've not given me as good an answer as that, I think. RGB is a screen. I don't know if you guys are.
additive and subtractive models.
Yes, absolutely. It's not important, so let's not delve too much into the color configurations.
You can ask me about it later.
There you go.
So
I really want to.
I'll be happy to tell you about it in detail.
So that's basic text. If you want to edit this, and this is valid for when we get to the final stage, when you're editing artwork that you've already been provided, there's a number of ways to begin editing text. Again, by selecting the type tool or pressing T for a shortcut. If you just hover over and click on it, it will place the cursor within the text where you drop it. If you have your direct selection or your selection tool available, just double clicking on it will put it into position as well, and you can edit from there. Okay, so that's the type tool. Anyone got any questions about type tool? That's probably the tool that you'll probably use most often for editing things, because if you've got a lower thirds, for example, when you're developing what they are, your type tool is the thing that you'll be changing from. So you change the name and positions and stuff like that.
I've used it before in Photoshop, and I have to say it takes a wee bit of getting used to.
Right. Okay.
The kind of logic I'm always thinking on it. I don't know what it is. Maybe just like that going in to edit each time I always go back to the T. create rather than let me edit and stuff.
Right,
So
okay.
maybe just wanted to double click when I needed to or stuff.
Well, like I say, double click should work. It should work
Yes.
relatively cleanly with it. That's generally the route in for me is double clicking because generally I've got this direct selection tool on screen.
I was just sort of
Please.
related to this question. So when you make your load build, it'll be a JPEG or a PNG, whatever it is. What's the source file? Is it an AI? What's the
Oh, so the source file for an Illustrator file,
what's
yes,
the file extension?
is .ai.
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 And then it would get produced in another format.
Yeah.
or whatever.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you can export these to JPEGs and PNGs, but the source file is exactly the right term. That is AI for Adobe Illustrator. Okay, going back into Keynote. The next tools, I'll maybe take a few of them just now to show. I will show the line tool, which is the second down on the right, and the polygon tool, which is the third down on the left. We've already kind of basically touched on these already when I was showing you how to select different groups. The line tool, as you can expect, allows you to, once it's been selected, the shortcut for this is backslash. Allows you to draw straight lines on its default mode. You can, interestingly, with the creating these polygon elements, these vector elements, that's allowing me to freely move around from the starting point to wherever I drop it. Just now, if I click away from that, if I select the shortcut for the direct selection tool, you'll not see it there whatsoever, because if you look at the colour and the stroke, there is no colour and stroke on it. So let's just pick a colour line for it, a stroke for it, and you can see there it's now appeared. A stroke or a line, if we go to the stroke definer within the sidebar, you've got options here in terms of how that line appears on the artboard and in the artwork. The weight of it, as you can imagine, is to do with the thickness of it. So if I ramp that up to 20 odd, I do note from the projector here that it's not particularly smooth. It's a lot smoother on the screen. The jagged edges that you're seeing on the screen and the projector there are not replicated in the artwork and will not be replicated in the video, I should say. So that is the weight of it. You can also change, I'm just going to zoom in on the end of it here. You can change the way that the ends appear. So you can click on a rounded end, or a square end, or a cropped end. If I go back, and what I'll do is I'll create a square. So I'll just select this just now again, and it takes, when you create a new piece of artwork, it copies the defined appearance of the previous object. So you'll see that has come up with a 20-point orange line to define the square. Because this is a closed shape, I can change the corner of it so that the round corners or beveled corners. And I can also define whether the stroke, the outline, appears in the middle of the object line, on the inside, or on the outside, which may or may not be useful in different circumstances. Okay. The point I was going to make before about the lines, and whether this applies to any of these vector elements, when you're creating them by dragging them, I'm freely moving around there. If you want to constrain it in one way or another, you can use different other shortcuts on the board. So if I press Shift, for example, it restricts it to being a square. If I press Alt, instead of moving it from the starting point in the top left hand corner, it defines the middle. You see it, I'm moving it around there. And if I do them together, it constrains it to a square and the middle, as opposed to just the left hand corner of it. Okay. With the line tool, the shift does something slightly different. So wherever I click, that's the first point in it. If I press the shift, it restricts it to 45 degrees. Just so you know, you can get a straight line going in one direction or another.
You're building a house here, are you?
It was actually a face.
Okay.
Yeah. Now I'm just showing off.
Okay.
Okay. You can once you've got objects defined like this, you can also edit them in terms of creating more interesting, more complex shapes. This is not a tool that I was intending to show, but we can do with the pen tool. You can hover over objects, and if you change the pen tool to, if you press the plus sign with the pen tool, it gives you the an additional node. And what you're doing basically is placing a node within that object, which I can select using not the direct selection, not the group selection tool. Sorry, I always call that the direct selection tool. What I've been showing you before is the group selection tool. The direct selection tool is the same but without a plus sign beside it. And that allows you to pick up not just where the selection tool picks up the whole object. The group selection tool allows you to pick the objects up sequentially, as I described earlier on. The direct selection tool allows you to pick up things like the even smaller than that, so single nodes. So I placed a node on that line when I used the plus sign, the plus pen tool. With the direct selection tool, which is A for shortcut, I can pick up individual nodes and move them about. I can pick them up as multiples as well by dragging and moving them around, if at all, to make someone look confused, perhaps. It applies here as well. It applies within objects that you've defined as squares. For example, you can just pull these around if required. Okay. There are other tools behind that. So I've said about the line tool. You can define these as arcs, so you can get nice curves. Again, if you press a shift, it will restrict it, so it's a perfect arc, as opposed to something which is quite kind of skewed if you don't use the shift button. You can do spirals as well, if you so require.
I didn't realise there was so much flexibility in it. It's really impressive.
Yeah. Even within that, I mean, for example, with the spiral tool, you can do certain things. If you want the spiral to be a little bit more detailed, you can press up and down. Can you press up and down? Yeah. Press up and down to add more spirals to it as required. You can also, if you're pressing shift, restrict it to the quarters again. And if you press alt, it allows you to pull them out, make them tighter. In fact, that's command. You can make them very tight or loose accordingly, if such a feature is important to the design. I'm just going to select all of these objects and just tidy up a wee bit, so that I can then go on to the shape tools. So the shape tools include the rectangle, which I've shown you before. Shift keeps it to a square. Pressing and holding, you can get a rounded rectangle tool. So that's the same, only it's got rounded corners. Although this tool is not as useful now, simply because there's been an advance in the program. I don't even know why they still offer this, because that's interesting. Now this suggests that the memory is getting used up very quickly.
Because we're recording.
It could be to do with that. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to come out of Illustrator again and just reload it. and hopefully that will fix the problem. Once we've been through these tools, I think we'll just take a quick 5-minute break.
Sounds good.
Yeah, that looks to have got us back. Yeah, something that what I was describing before was with a rectangle. Let me just put the weight up there. You can create rounded corners very easily. You've got these new features in the corners, and that allows you to pull them in and create rounded corners very easily without having to use a rounded corner rectangle tool. What else have we got? We've got star shapes, or polygons. Polygons are going to be quite important for what I'm going to do at the end. Polygons are multi-sided shapes. The default is a hexagon, but you can change that to be however many you want by, whilst you're pulling it to the right size, you can press up or down so you can get more or less sides. So that allows you to pick
Yeah, that's cool.
equilateral triangles at the bare minimum and go as many as you want thereafter. So I'll go down to triangles because, as the demonstration described earlier on, what we're aiming for is going to use a lot of triangles, so that's a good one to know. So yeah, so that's the polygons. Any others? Star tool. Star's quite fancy. Again, with these, you can have many-sided stars by pressing up or down whilst you've selected them. I should say, another way to create these shapes, you don't have to just click and drag. You can also, if you just double-click on the artboard, or in fact it's just single-click, it will bring you up a dialog box, and that dialog box can define what you want in terms of whether it's a star, whether it's a triangle, whether it's a polygon, a line, a square, any of them. If you have the particular tool and you just click once on the artboard, it will give you a dialog box which allows you to precisely create the shape that you want. So that's a 100 pixel by 100 pixel circle there. Okay, so that's very basic shape creation on the artboard. Go back into this. Okay, the next two are to do with scale, reflection scales. So let me just get rid of these two and we'll concentrate on the triangles. So these options are, so this is reflect. You can use this to basically, I'm going to show you this, and then like symmetrical shapes are probably not the best ones to use for this, because when you flip it, it will still appear as if it's the same one. You can do it this way. So if I click on a position I want to reflect the tool from, so say I want to reflect it at the top, I can click at the top, and then I can drag this so it's reflected perfectly. Let me make a more complex shape so you can actually see the effect a little bit better. If I wanted a reflection of this shape, I can select it. I can copy it by pressing Command C. I can paste it back into the same place by doing Command F. And with the reflection tool, place on the nodes and then drag and then drop it, and that's me created a reflection of that, a mirror image of it.
And it's Control F and not Control V.
Yes, so what Control V does, that's a good example of me just explaining something or doing something without impacting. If I do Command C to copy something, if I do Command V, it pastes it into the middle of the screen that you're looking at. What Command F represents is command in front. So basically you're copying in front of its position. You can also do Command B, which is behind. So it places it either in front or behind of the object that's selected,
Oh, that's good to know.
which is useful when you're beginning to do things like, so if I just pick a colour for example, And when we get to things like transparency, so if I change this to a multiply, I'll explain what multiply is as opposed to another transparency effect. If I do Command and F in front of that with a different colour, helps to do it there. There may be reasons why you want it to be. In fact, let's not even worry about transparency just now. If I wanted a shape to appear in front of it, it'd be there.
And if you want to be behind it, Control B then.
Yep. And so if I want the same shape now to appear, so if I want the blue to be behind the top green one, so Command B, that's me pasting it behind it. And you'll see if you go into layers, it just simply drops it below it in the layers. Okay. Yeah, so that is Command V for pasting it in the middle of your screen, Command F for pasting in front of the object in place, and Command B for behind in place. Okay. So we did. Let me bring up Polygon 2 again. So we did reflect, which allows you to create a reflection tool. But the hidden object in this one is the rotate tool. So again, you'll see that where I'm placing the cursor, where the cursor is placed, and you click on a particular point, it rotates it to that point, using that point as the anchor point, as the point you rotate from. So for example, if I want to take this triangle and make it buttress up against the other one, I would take the rotate tool and I would click it onto the anchor of either of the objects in this case, but this one, and I can rotate it round so that it then buttresses perfectly into place there. Now I'm just going to select both of them, get rid of it there, sorry. So yeah, so what I've done there is rotated it so that it buttresses perfectly against that, which when we're creating the logo later on will make sense as to why we need to do that. It just keeps it nice and tidy. Okay, just give it a different colour so that you can see the difference. Okay, so that's the reflect and the rotate tool. The next one is the scale tool, but we also have, I would say, the scale tool and the shear tool. I'll show you here rather than the reshape tool. Scale tool, as you can imagine, is just for increasing or decreasing the scale of the object. Again, you can define it by the point, so if you shortcut for this one is the S button, or if you click on it to get the scale tool, again click on the node that you want to provide the anchor, and then drag it according to that. Again, if you want to keep the same, I can create this to scale by X and Y no matter how I want, but if I want to keep it the same shape, if I want to constrain the proportions, I press Shift. Why is that not working? No, Alt. No? Why is that not? Yes, it's Shift. And that constrains the proportions of it. The other one is the shear tool, and that is basically trying to shift it all into parallelograms if it was a square, but the same applies. It just allows you to move it in these kind of weird angles. There's not many circumstances I'm sure that you'll come across that you have to use that one, but I use that quite a lot with some of my design projects. So that's your rotate, reflect, scale and shear tools. Let's just have a quick look, see what else we covered. Eyedropper tool. Eyedropper tool is very useful. Eyedropper allows you to take on the style of in one object of another object within. So for example, if I wanted this black object to appear green, I can select the eyedropper tool, pick the object I want to change, and then click on an object I want it to reflect in terms of its style. So it's changed it to green with no stroke, with no outline. And that allows you to very quickly change things so that they mirror the different characteristics. It also works with text. So for example, I'm just going to increase this. If I want the text to appear green, I can select the text, go over to an object that is the green that I want, and click on it, and it'll change it to the colour of green that object is. It also works with fonts. So I'm just going to copy and paste lorem ipsum there. If I change this font to something completely different, brush script. If I want to change the original to a brush script, I can select the original, go to the eyedropper tool, click on that, and it will change it to that font. If all you were wanting to do was to change its colour, but not the font, if you select the object that you want to change, you go over to the object, and if it happens to be a font, if you press Shift and click on it, it will just change the colour rather than the font. Okay, we're getting into the sort of real kind of deep kind of things. I don't think you guys will necessarily need to use it, but I think it's sometimes good to kind of show how easy it is, simply so that you don't be scared of using some of these tools. The other thing I should have put up right up front, the most important thing I ever learned as a designer is Control Z or Command Z. Everything can be undone. Never be scared of it. I almost called my company Control Z because I was scared of having made a mistake when I decided, But my wife was right. It sounds too negative to be worrying about mistakes. But yeah, you should never be afraid of making mistakes. You can always roll them back, generally speaking. So that's the eyedropper tool. Did I highlight any other tools? The hand tool and the zoom tool. I showed you the zoom tool before, didn't I? So you can select that and you can either drag or you can click and hold or tap. So you've got those options. The hand tool, I don't know if you've seen me use this. This is just basically, I'm just going to zoom in using the plus there. When you've got multiple items or you've got lots of things going on the artboard, you might want to move between different things. If you press the space bar or you select the hand bar, the shortcut is the space bar. You can drag and move your artboard about. It's just handy if you need to sort of just move about and be able to view different things. So it doesn't do anything to the artwork, it's just your view of the artboard. If you want to just see the artboard that you're working on, a great shortcut is Command 0. If you press Command 0, it centers your artboard and resizes it to the precise height. Okay, so that's the principal tools that you'll use. Do you guys want to take a break just now? Yeah. And then we'll look a little bit more at the layers and the artboards and how you can create things just to make it a little bit when you're setting up the artwork so that it's nice and tidy and arranged in a solid fashion. Okay.
Grand.
So let's say 5 minutes. I'm conscious of time actually. We're in till 4:30, isn't it? Is that? So we've got about an hour after this, so a short break, and then we'll kind of move quite quickly, I think, into doing the logo after this, I think. Yeah?
Can I get you anything else?
No, I'm fine with the coffee. Thanks.